A damp drip echoes in a wine cellar. A clay amphora sweats in the torchlight. A hand unscrews a small vial, the air turning sharp with bitter resin. Somewhere above, a crowd rehearses laughter, the kind that hurts more than knives. Power often begins with a whisper, and tonight it whispers a cruel performance. Ancient sources report this ending differently, yet they agree on the intent: humiliation as spectacle. What kind of empire asks a survivor to play the part of his own ruin? The answer hides in the corridors where orders move faster than mercy. Here, names blur, bodies are repurposed, and memory is hammered into a mask. Step closer, and you can hear the script being fitted to a living throat. The near consequence is simple. If the show goes on, a person becomes a prop. Walk with me to the first door, where someone decides that dying might be kinder than being performed. They found him where the city forgets its young, between errands, lessons, and the cheaper stalls. A guard's glance held a calculation. A steward's smile covered a command. He had quick hands, careful eyes, and a quiet that made others speak too much. Accounts differ about his birth and trade. Evidence is fragmentary, yet the outline holds. Someone decided the boy could fit a ghost. Was there any refuge once the gaze of power settled, patient as a hawk above a field? He was escorted, not dragged, because courtesy is a leash with velvet knots. The palace doors opened like a mouth that had practiced swallowing objections. Promises arrived first: safety, patronage, a shield against street dangers. Then came the fine print, laid out in glances, not ink. Refusal would mean the arena, acceptance, a life set to another's metronome. The near consequence is brutal in its neatness. Death becomes the gentler option than a comedy staged for thousands. Bridge your attention now from the capture to the cause, how a single night of fury turned longing into policy, and grief into a workshop for remaking flesh. Rome liked to call itself eternal, but its rituals aged like spoiled perfume. Laws paraded in marble, while exceptions traveled faster in whispered favors. The palace was a theater where etiquette softened commands and sharpened results. This is not merely decadence. It is policy wearing silk gloves over iron fingers. Ancient sources report generosity and art, yet their silences shout louder than their praise. What breaks a person first, the wound or the renaming that follows without consent? Identity theft here was not about coins or seals. It hijacked breath, posture, memory. A living body became the raw material for repairing a ruler's broken story. Courtiers learned the choreography quickly because survival depends on knowing the steps. Priests rehearsed blessings, scribes prepared new titles, musicians tuned for joy no one felt. Scholars argue about motives, and the record is uneven. Still, patterns persist across pages. Power tested its technology on flesh, then wrapped the experiment in hymns and crowns. When the crowd clapped, it was often from fear, not delight or agreement. You can hear the machinery humming beneath the flutes, efficient and cold as a millstone. The near consequence is stark. Once procedures harden, a person is processed, not persuaded. Bridge your focus now to the moment the machinery engaged. One furious night, one fatal blow. Grief did not heal. Grief recruited. From that spark, policy took shape, and a private loss became public doctrine. Our next step is the first crack in reality, when love and violence kissed. The first crack sounded like pottery shattering against marble, sudden and unforgiving. Raised voices tangled with sandals scraping, a flash of anger collapsing into stunned silence. She folded toward the floor, still and breathless, the room forgetting how to move. Ancient sources differ, yet many sketch a fatal blow, delivered in a blind rage. There was a child not yet born, an absence that echoed louder than voices. He shouted orders, then apologies, then orders again, as if volume could reverse time. Servants ran for oils, bandages, physicians, prayers, anything that could stitch reality. What breaks a world faster, a single blow, or the story built to excuse it? The palace practiced stillness, the way actors freeze when the playwright enters late. Grief did not arrive clean. It tracked mud, rumor, and blame across polished floors. Observers later painted mercy, but the brush kept slipping, revealing panic underneath. He could not undo the moment, so he tried to redraw its perimeter. If loss was unbearable, perhaps it could be remodeled, disciplined, and made obedient. The near consequence was policy. Private guilt began drafting a public program in grief's name. Bridge now to the funeral's glitter, where incense rose to hide a deepening fracture. The funeral rehearsed perfection, an answer scripted in gold leaf and expensive smoke. Priests counted steps, poured saffron oils, and lifted hymns until the ceiling forgot silence. Embalmers worked like jewelers, measuring wounds with reverence, speaking softly to keep the air obedient. Ancient sources report a splendid cortege, yet their admiration keeps glancing away from the wound. Perfumes thickened the hallways, turning grief into a fragrance that lingered on everyone's tongue. Marble horses pawed the street. Musicians stitched flutes and drums into a single, well-behaved heartbeat. Was splendor meant to honor the dead or to hypnotize the living into forgiveness? Masks shone, laurel crowns dipped, and the city learned again how to stare without blinking. The bier floated past, steady as law, while doubt hid behind banners embroidered with victories. Scribes captured titles and virtues, careful to omit the noise that cracked the palace. Observers later praised the spectacle. Even sympathetic pages admit the shine outpaced the sorrow. He watched with a stillness that resembled devotion, yet his fists kept counting invisible beats. If ritual could frame the loss, perhaps it could also repaint the face that absence erased. The near consequence settled like ash. When beauty conceals violence, memory volunteers to become an accomplice. Bridge your attention to the nights that followed, where sleep refused him and routine hardened into obsession. Nights lengthened like corridors with no doors, and sleep refused every bargain he offered. He paced mosaics until the grout remembered his steps and the lamps surrendered their oil. Servants learned to breathe quietly because noise ripened his temper faster than summer fruit. He ate at strange hours, then sent the plates away untouched, chasing a vanished appetite. Robes were arranged to match old mornings. Jewels were selected to echo specific afternoons. He ordered perfumes blended to resurrect a hallway's exact mood from a distant spring. Ancient sources report musicians at midnight, their strings tuned to comfort a restless emperor. Could routine, repeated precisely, convince memory to return with the face he had lost? He began dictating details no one else noticed, how laughter started smaller, how silences stacked. Letters went out to merchants, actors, and barbers, collecting rumors like nets gather minnows. A whisper became instruction. Find resemblance. Any shred of it, no matter how fragile. Pain was being translated into errands, and errands into rules everyone pretended were reasonable. Courtiers nodded, then sprinted. Artisans promised likenesses, then flinched when sketches betrayed their limits. He tested wigs, mirrors, shadows, any tool that might bend absence into a serviceable outline. The near consequence tightened its grip. If memory could not be recovered, it would be manufactured instead. Follow the trail of orders spreading across the city now, toward studios and street corners where a ruler's hunger turns every similar face into a summons. Word went out like a net cast at dawn, wide, silent, and full of promise. Messengers traced alleys and atriums, contracting painters, carvers, and mask makers with sealed incentives. Studios filled with candles and guesses, chalk dust climbed the air as if trying to draw itself into a face. Artists tried symmetry, then shadows, then the fine tremor of eyelids in lamplight. A cameo emerged from sardonyx, flawless in profile, yet lifeless where memory had kept its spark. Workshops lined up wax busts that sweated under torches, as if anxious to pass for living. What price does resemblance demand when truth has already left the room? Some sketches almost comforted him until the mouth was wrong by a whisper, the eyes by a winter. He rejected them gently, then impatiently, then with a chill that trimmed sentences to commands. Editorial aside, even generous patrons bruise art when they demand miracles on schedule. Priests blessed pigments. Courtiers nudged artisans to see better, as though vision obeyed rank. A rumor gained weight. The search was not for likeness alone, but for breath arranged like hers. Then came bounties for information, places, names, habits, anything that might lead a gaze home. Markets learned to hold their applause. Matching became a hazard, not a game. The near consequence gathered itself. When art failed, living bodies would be asked to finish the portrait. Follow that urgency now into the streets at noon, where a boy's eyes caught the light exactly, and fate decided to stop looking. Midday burned the paving stones when the search finally found what sketches could not. The boy paused between errands, balancing a parcel, eyes catching light like a remembered chord. A steward slowed first, then a captain. The street learned to hold its breath politely. He was educated enough to bow, poor enough to accept coin, careful enough to listen. Ancient sources report different origins for him. Accounts differ, evidence is fragmentary, names uncertain. What they share is that a gaze landed and would not lift again. The mouth's tilt matched by accident. The eyelids closed with a patient cadence memory approved. How could a glance become a verdict that rearranged another human being? Compliments arrived like doves. Invitations followed, trimmed with silk and the scent of safety. He was told his talent was presence, his future a staircase of generous patrons. He was told he resembled someone honored, and honor travels better with obedience. A carriage door opened with a sigh, the city reflected in its polished skin. He stepped inside because refusal felt theatrical, and theater can be deadly when audiences judge. In the palace, corridors multiplied, until direction meant whatever the guide decided quietly. Greetings rehearsed sincerity. Servants practiced saying his name as if learning a role together. The near consequence settled quickly. His life would be rewritten in the tense of another's longing. Carry this forward into the closing circle now, where physicians receive instructions, and cooperation becomes the only safe medicine. They escorted him through doors that sighed like old actors asked to play innocence again. Courtiers smiled with a precision that made apology and command indistinguishable in daylight. Physicians were summoned with compliments first, then reminded of salaries that could suddenly forget them. A chamber was chosen for its quiet, its drains, its distance from indiscreet ears. Instruments lay in a disciplined row. Hooks, needles, compresses, each glint promising usefulness without mercy. Contracts appeared, ink still damp, promising patronage if results behaved like miracles on cue. Could healing be honest when the goal was to edit a living biography into compliance? The chief physician nodded too often, calculating risks the way sailors measure shallow reefs. Editorial note: ethics drowns quickest when logistics arrives before language can name the harm. Servants rehearsed comforts, practicing touches that looked kind and landed like measurements. The boy learned new vocabulary at speed: diet, fasting, sedation, each word a corridor with fewer exits. Behind a screen, officials agreed that necessity is a lens that makes cruelty look focused. Threats did not shout. They perched beside rewards, sharing a plate as if relatives at dinner. The plan received its final polish: a before, an after, and a silence to bridge them. The near consequence pressed close. Once the schedule hardened, his body would become a timetable. Others obeyed. Step with me now to the threshold of the operation, where breath counts down and pain rehearses its entrance, and the corridor outside learns to stand still. The corridor held its breath while water simmered, linens steamed, and lamps softened edges. Inside, instruments waited on folded cloth, shining like answers rehearsed before questions arrived. He lay still, pulse stubborn, eyes measuring ceiling cracks as if mapping exits. Sedation in that era was a compromise. Courage and binding did most of the work. Ancient sources report attendance, physicians, and silence, but disagree about methods they dare not detail. Pain announced itself quickly, traveled the ribs, and climbed the hallway like unwelcome music. Outside, he paced the mosaic, counting heartbeats he pretended belonged to someone being born. What kind of love times itself by screams and calls it devotion under sanctified roofs? The physician murmured to steady hands. Assistants answered with cloth, pressure, and practiced nods. A basin received what language refused to describe. The room kept working, never looking away. Decisions made earlier continued making themselves one stitch at a time, indifferent to witnesses. History rarely softens procedures ordered by power. It merely notes how clean the bandages looked. The cry that ended the operation didn't sound victorious. It sounded like a door locking. The near consequence formed immediately. Recovery would double as rehearsal for a role without alternatives. Bridge your attention to the days that followed, where care disguised as craft shaped a new outline. Care arrived on schedule, precise as a jeweler judging flaws in stone. Linens were lifted, wounds inspected, and solutions mixed like recipes memorized by scent. The room learned a new tempo, gentler sounds covering a strict choreography of touch. He measured improvement by how quickly attendants looked away from pain's impolite expressions. Ointments cooled, compresses tightened, and whispers promised that endurance would eventually feel like progress. The patron visited softly, praising courage, correcting pillows, and adjusting light as if framing art. Gratitude became the safest dialect, each thank you polishing the logic that built this gallery. When does caretaking turn from kindness into curation, arranging a person to match a memory? Nurses tracked fever with bowls of water, counting breaths like beads strung on a cord. Infection hovered often, an invisible critic sniffing for weakness around edges and stitches. He learned to lie still because motion invited lectures about responsibility to the miracle. Many commentators note how care behaves like craft when outcomes are non negotiable. Sleep returned in rationed portions. Dreams arrived carrying borrowed perfumes and rehearsed laughter. He woke to tutored posture, to gentle corrections that treated hesitation like a tear. The near consequence settled quietly. Each act of kindness filed him deeper into the commissioned outline. Follow that line into the next room, where recovery becomes training. Voice, gait, smile, wardrobe. Lessons began at dawn, when voices carry cleanly and doubt sleeps the latest. A tutor warmed vowels with humming, then loosened consonants using old actor tricks. He learned to end sentences softly, like lifting curtains rather than slamming doors. Breath was counted on fingers, shaping phrases into loops that matched remembered cadences. Posture followed next, shoulders lowered, chin angled, steps shortened to whisper across floors. Mirrors multiplied until one reflection learned to correct the others without being asked. Smiles practiced three tempos: greeting, reassurance, dismissal, each rehearsed until muscles understood the script. Wardrobes assembled obediently, color by color, pattern by pattern, according to archived afternoons. Perfumers rebuilt a vanished aura, steeping resins and flowers to recover a particular dusk. Could imitation become safety if everyone agreed to forget where the outline originated? Servants applauded small victories because progress feeds hope, and hope keeps days moving forward. The patron visited, adjusting bracelets, offering praise, and correcting posture with a lover's patience. Editorial aside, training can feel like freedom when choices are measured in inches, not miles. Laughter returned on cue, distant and bright, like a bird trained to land quietly. Etiquette sealed the lessons, teaching hands to speak before mouths had time to misstep. The near consequence was unmistakable. Practice replaced memory, thinning the border between role and self. It carried that thinning line into the next chamber, where borrowed recollections begin to populate silence. Silence collects quickly in new rooms, so they filled it with curated memories on purpose. Friends of the dead were invited to lunch, each course paired with a story rehearsed carefully. He learned favorite fruits, tolerable wines, and the way laughter drifted after jokes grew tired. A seamstress described rainy afternoons, a maid sketched morning rituals nobody had thought to record. Musicians offered playlists from last spring, claiming certain modes softened tempers and sharpened attention meaningfully. A cook swore, by thyme and honey, whispering that grief quieted when steam rose. Could a life be reconstructed from anecdotes, like a mosaic patched with borrowed tiles and glue? He repeated opinions until they fit, trimming edges when conversations snagged on inconvenient pasts. A philosopher suggested gentler stances on theater. A charioteer urged stronger cheers for certain colors. Scribes compiled these fragments like botanists, pressing habits between pages to preserve a fragile silhouette. Editorial note: nostalgia is efficient propaganda when witnesses crave permission to misremember together. He practiced signatures that were not his, then abandoned ink for gestures everyone preferred to recognize. Visitors cried from relief more than faith. Resemblance loosened fear enough to let commerce breathe. He found small pleasures, warm bread, garden shade, then flinched when gratitude felt like treason against himself. Evenings ended with recitations of yesterday, everyone nodding as if tomorrow promised the same. The near consequence settled plainly. Borrowed memories began colonizing blank hours, reducing him to well-managed echoes. Carry that echo into the chandeliered hall, where unveiling waits, music tuned, veils lifted, and names rehearsed. The grand hall glittered like a mirror that refused to admit fingerprints tonight. Musicians cued a bright mode, and doors unfolded in a practiced, breathless sequence. Torches embroidered the air with gold, and every glance rehearsed loyalty without blinking. He entered slowly, as if the floor itself were a stage begging for applause. Courtiers spaced themselves into symmetry, turning survival into geometry anyone could memorize quickly. A veil hovered, a name hovered, and silence held its balance like a coin. He raised his hand, smiled, and called the buried name into the living room. Could one syllable deputize hundreds of witnesses to pretend memory had returned faithfully? Applause answered instantly, vigorous enough to drown misgivings, careful enough to absolve nobody. Servants bowed deeper. Officials found reasons to agree. Poets edited metaphors mid-breath. He approached the boy, greeting not a stranger but the echo everyone was ordered to hear. Perfume drifted like consent. Protocol stitched the scene until doubt forgot its original posture. A toast rose, practiced lines praising constancy, artistry, and the healing power of devotion. The city had a new headline, and headlines decide which futures feel negotiable. Near consequence, once named in public, refusal hardens into treason, and treason invites theater with knives. Carry this momentum through the next door, where ceremony sharpens its quills and writes a marriage. Morning arrived lacquered with saffron, the veil's flame casting honeyed light across stone. Priests traced circles in air, blessing thresholds, bracelets, and the path between two rehearsed lives. He wore a ring the color of wet leaves. Attendants whispered that emerald promised luck. Flutes braided with drums, steady as law. Flowers rehearsed their sweetness without asking permission. Vows were trimmed to fit the costume, spoken softly so nobody bruised the illusion. Witnesses counted omens like accountants, balancing dread with pageantry in neat public columns. Is a union lawful when its grammar is coercion and its music edits memory? The veil fell, rose, and settled again, teaching cameras where to look and linger. Hands touched shoulders, lips rehearsed gratitude, and signatures marched like soldiers across attentive parchment. He smiled because smiling is armor. He breathed because breath was the only unscripted thing. Blessings multiplied, confetti of words sticking to skin that had run out of exits. Scribes titled the scene as Triumph. Merchants priced commemorative ribbons before the ink dried. The city exhaled, relieved the story finally had a shape that spent well in daylight. Near consequence, ritual converted private force into public virtue, licensing the performance to travel safely. Cross the harbor now with the procession, toward games and garlands in Greece where ceremony keeps proving itself useful. Ships cut the Aegean like quills, carrying singers, officials, and an audience on payroll. Greece welcomed the procession with garlands, altars, and calendars kindly adjusted for victory. Stadiums filled, announcements blossomed, wreaths waited for a brow already rehearsed for triumph. He followed beside, titled correctly, draped precisely, a presence lacquered until doubt slid off. Festivals tuned their flutes to imperial pitch. Poets stitched epigrams that clothed the air. Some historians note that timetables bent helpfully whenever applause needed extra daylight. Could applause sanctify grief, turning private insistence into policy that parades without shame? Temples offered incense, theaters offered encores. The sea kept breathing like a patient metronome. In private rooms, he was asked to repeat a laugh, a glance, a tilt. Perfumes traveled in locked chests. Recipes guarded like laws, mood engineered to match old evenings. He learned routes through porticos where praise echoed, then died quickly behind closed cedar. Crowds smiled because smiling is safer than analysis when stipends depend on harmony. He waved because waving kept questions from forming. He bowed because bowing buys minutes. Editorial. Pageantry is efficient. It launders desire by hiring witnesses and calling them citizens. The near consequence was expansion. The role became exportable, rehearsed across provinces until exits vanished. Carry this pressure forward into narrow corridors of choice, where a few thin chances flicker like candles. Freedom first arrived, disguised as timing, a door unguarded 3 breaths longer than usual. He paused, listened, stepped, then retreated when sandals clicked like verdicts around the corner. Another night, he sent a note folded into bread, destined for a cautious sailor. Coins changed hands, directions were memorized, courage negotiated with fear and lost on technicalities. Witnesses later disagree on details. Scholars argue. Motives are inferred from very quiet footprints. What counts as freedom when choices are measured in gestures, not miles or declarations? He tried silence at dinner, hoping absence could speak. It only summoned tutors with smiles. He tried humor too sharp. It dulled quickly against etiquette thick as parchment. A friendly guard advised patience. The word escort stretched kindly to include surveillance. Kindness multiplied, curiously synchronized, like rain scheduled to cancel inconvenient fires. Editorial. Soft punishments work. They leave fewer marks while teaching obedience more thoroughly. He bargained for temple visits, walked slower near crowded markets, learned the city's sympathetic corners. Messages were intercepted politely, favors expired, doors learned to close at the right volume. Each attempt drew warmer praise in public and cooler air in private chambers afterward. The near consequence was contraction. His map shrank until trust became a room with windows painted on. Bridge your attention to the year of collapsing thrones, when tides turned and new hands claimed old stories. Year 68 unstitched the empire like a seam tugged by too many impatient hands. Legions argued with treasuries, while governors weighed letters against their chances with anxious household gods. Rome learned a new rhythm. rumor galloping faster than official drums could ever possibly answer. He listened behind curtains as allies rehearsed loyalty in several conjugations and careful tenses at once. The patron circle thinned, then cracked, proving affection expires when stipends forget their scheduled visits. Ancient sources report frantic rides, whispered loans, and doors that stopped recognizing long-trusted palace passwords. When the final message arrived, it promised safety, farmland, and an honorable exit from history. He was not asked. He was informed. The grammar colder than winter breathed across marble. The city woke to condolences measured carefully, as if grief could be invoiced monthly and filed. Oaths shifted like boats changing docks, and a new claimant signed documents with confident flourish. Otho's courtiers moved quickly, their signatures learning curves that imitated mercy, convincingly for nervous audiences. He was displayed, then introduced, an echo repurposed, as bridge between thrones hungry for continuity. Could legitimacy be borrowed from a living person the way one borrows ceremonial armor and plume? Otho praised constancy, stroked the air with promises, and cued attendants to nod in rhythm. Editorial. Continuity often means stapling yesterday to today, then calling the stitches providence and duty. He stood where told, a walking vow, while poets adjusted metaphors to flatter abrupt transitions. Near consequence, his survival value increased, binding him tighter to ceremonies he could never refuse. Bridge your attention to the next claimant, where calculations deepen and custody changes practiced hands again. Power flipped again before triumph learned the room, and new banners stalked Rome's avenues at noon. Soldiers wrote history with boots, while letters chased outcomes like children chasing impatient kites across roofs. Otho's sunrise was short. By early spring, northern drums spoke a harsher and less forgiving grammar. Vitellius arrived with appetites and allies, carrying ledgers that balanced cruelty with comfortable dinners for friends. Introductions repeated and protocols reprinted, he was presented as inheritance rather than individual personhood or agency. Ancient sources report gifts, private meals, and a smile measuring usefulness by the length of candles. The new court explored him cautiously, then confidently, as collectors evaluate an acquisition under favorable light. What happens when value depends on resemblance, and resemblance becomes a currency that never sleeps anywhere? He relearned hallways where kindness traveled with guards spaced carefully, like punctuation controlling complicated paragraphs. Vitellius listened, nodded, and requested performances proving continuity to officers still calculating which oath mattered. Editorial. Certain regimes mistake theater for policy, hiring better costumers and louder drums to persuade skeptics. He complied, where compliance saved bruises, resisting only when resistance resembled prayerful hesitation in lamplight. Private conversations floated darker entertainments, jokes circling pits and borrowing old myths for scripts tonight nervously. More guests laughed than protested, because laughter is cheaper than courage beneath volatile plastered ceilings tonight. He felt the perimeter narrowing, choices counting backward like torches burning steadily toward their shallow cups. Near consequence, passed like regalia, he became precedent, useful, portable, and therefore increasingly endangered everywhere this season. Bridge your focus to the announced spectacle, a plan polished for crowds, humiliation, and unavoidable cheers. Posters bloomed on walls before dawn, ink fresh, trumpets promising laughter and novelty. Stagehands measured the arena, tailors unpacked costumes, a choreographer counted beats with impatient knuckles. A theme leaked first, then hardened, an abduction from myth, repainted as cheerful satire. Scripts circled privately, jokes practiced cruelty that landed clean, like knives disguised as compliments. Vendors negotiated stalls. Officials praised catharsis. Drummers tested echoes against the stone and sky. He heard details in pieces, each fragment heavier than the last rehearsed smile. Some called it entertainment. Others looked at floors, studying patterns to avoid agreement. When humiliation is rehearsed publicly, who is safe to refuse the invitation loudly? Courtiers suggested bravery could convert ridicule into victory. Arithmetic disguised itself as counsel again. A trainer outlined choreography, steps that ended with a lesson nobody would forget. Rumor swore the final tableau required him as prize, laughing as the crowd learned. More laughed than objected. Laughter is cheaper than courage when paydays stand nearby counting. Witnesses later insisted they had doubts. The silence that night remembers otherwise completely. He traced exits on his palm, a map shrinking whenever hoofbeats rehearsed outside. The city glowed with anticipation. Torches pretending sunlight could be scheduled into midnight. Near consequence, once spectacle is announced, escape becomes treason, and treason becomes part of the show. Bridge your attention to the last undecided hours, where a smaller, fiercer courage chooses another door. The night folded around him like a cloak that knew how to keep secrets. A servant brought water, another checked lamps, footsteps faded toward corners that practiced forgetting. He opened a small box, familiar as prayer, careful as a final signature. Ancient sources report different instruments and helpers. Accounts differ, evidence is fragmentary and strained. He paused long enough to name himself inwardly, a vow no ceremony could edit. What does survival mean if tomorrow requires rehearsing your undoing for a laughing audience? He drank or cut or breathed the bitter that stops rehearsals. Sources choose their verbs. The room listened. Air thinned. Time stepped back, then forward, honoring a private decision. A guard knocked once, waited, then chose mercy by misunderstanding the silence completely tonight. Somewhere else, a stage manager rehearsed cues. The city dreamed of spectacle arriving punctually. No music played here, only breath counting shorter measures until counting lost its purpose. Kindness arrived late, carrying alarms and basins. It found a stillness that refused negotiation. The body belonged to him again for one austere moment, unlit by orders or applause. It is not triumph, it is a refusal to donate pain to entertainment. Near consequence, the show loses its centerpiece and the city wakes to a quieter shame. Bridge now to the ledger of complicity. Physicians, tutors, priests, and courtiers, how each kept the machine oiled. Morning retellings arrived, polished, their edges sanded smooth by professional courtesy and fear. Scribes traded verbs like coins, choosing softer ones whenever guilt stood too close. Physicians spoke in measurements, not names, because numbers rarely blush before the living. Tutors preferred progress reports, improvement photographs cleanly when doubt is inconvenient and late. Priests praised obedience as healing, blessing procedures while avoiding the nouns that bled. Courtiers mastered sympathies that sounded expensive, then vanished when witnesses stopped listening carefully. Artists kept stipends by forgetting sketches that missed by a breath or winter. Guards called surveillance protection. Accountants filed silence beneath maintenance, candles, linens, and incense. When everyone performs a sliver of harm, who owns the blade completely tonight? Records hesitate whenever survival and honesty share the same ink and ledger fiercely. Editorial. Systems recruit ordinary skills, healing, teaching, praising, then pivot them toward efficient unpersoning discreetly. Neighbors told themselves kindness. Audiences told themselves necessity. Both purchase sleep on credit tonight. Scholars argue about names because names are handles, and handles lift responsibility carefully. Even memory negotiated, learning which hallway jokes were safe to repeat publicly today. Near consequence, distributed guilt dissolves into fog, leaving a machine that feels ownerless and tireless. Bridge your attention to the closing light now, where consequences gather and a question refuses silence. Power touched flesh and memory, until both forgot where their borders once lived. Rituals rehearsed mercy, while converting force into virtue that could travel safely anywhere. Witnesses learned survival grammar, calling coercion devotion because rent and rations prefer harmony. Near consequence 1. Language bends first, and soon entire cities speak in flattering disguises. Near consequence 2. Ceremonies outsource harm to helpers, teaching kindness to escort obedience politely. Near consequence 3. Legitimacy becomes a costume, passed between rulers without ever touching accountability. What breaks the cycle faster? Refusing the script or renaming the stage until truth returns? He is gone, but the choreography remains, practiced wherever applause is cheaper than courage. If bodies can be edited, so can customs. Both require witnesses who stop nodding. The question lingers like incense after drums. Where do we stand when masks descend? Bridge, then, to the next reckoning. 4 emperors in one fevered year, and rituals stubbornly surviving. We will follow the machinery through upheaval, testing whether thrones change faster than habits.